Indeed, ladies and gentlemen, feel very much welcome. This is our session, and it comes at the background of the desire to implement Istanbul Principle. And as Tete has eloquently put it, enabling environment is where our partnership begins with all the partners, whether they are donors or governments. And indeed, it is a commitment by the governments to do something for CSOs to make them effective. And it is in that context that we feel that in celebrating the 7th year plus of Istanbul Principle, that we also situate our enabling environment. And indeed, as we program on rolling out Istanbul Principle, then we must also be able to discuss how best should we address the issue of enabling environment for CSOs going forward. And I have a very capable panel with me. I don't know all their CVs, so I'll avoid going into those details. But I know all their names. So, so I'm told that is enough. So from the farthest end, we have HAMEED, right? RUMMAN HAMEED, from VANI, which is a voluntary organization from India. It's a very big organization, a very big network that works on policy issues, but also strengthens capacity of CSOs in India, as I understand. Then you have the bull of the Middle East, ZIAD HAMEED. But on a serious note, ZIAD has been very, very committed to the cause of the Middle East, to the cause of strengthening the CSOs in the Middle East, and in that regard really understands that environment with regard to what needs to be done, and indeed how we, international community, can also support the efforts of our colleagues in the Middle East. We all know how Middle East is, and we don't need to explain. If you want to discuss fragility issues, go to the Middle East and you'll see the real impact, the real human face there. And we are really honored to have him to come and help us understand the dynamics in the Middle East and how we can address enabling environment issues there. Then next to him is my friend, my good friend, MODIBO MAKALOU, who is a true CSO friend from the government side, always ready and willing to support the CSO initiatives, and has been working for a number of years indeed in seeing how to create spaces and spots for CSOs to engage with the governments and acting as an interlocutor. He works for the government of Mali and also advises the presidents on the issues of development cooperation, and is a co-chair of the task team on CSO Development Effectiveness and Enabling Environment. And we are very, very happy and honored to have you with us to have this discussion. Next to me is the father of the godfather of development effectiveness agenda, and indeed the most passionate person when it comes to civil society issues. Whether you are an activist or a policy guy, Tony will always have your back, and indeed has been at the core of strengthening South and best CSOs with regard to the engagements both at the global and the national level. And we are very honored also to have him with us to share some of his experiences based on a number of years that he's worked on these issues, on enabling environment and many more. So today we are very lucky, like I said, and I want us to move straight to the issues that we are supposed to discuss, which, as you have heard, mirror on issues of policy dialogue, issues of financing CSOs, and issues of social and legal and regulated environment, and how those indeed affect civil society organizations. And I don't want us to discuss this in vacuum. We want us to discuss this to the extent that it relates to the Istanbul principles, given that it's a commitment and we must really deliver Nairobi. And like we said yesterday, we will not commit to delivering Nairobi if enabling environment is given to us. So I want to start with my friend MODIBO, that you have been working for a number of years with CSOs. And can you please help us understand how your government is engaging CSOs at the national level? What has been some of the challenges, both from the government and the CSO side?
Thank you, Major. Hello. Thank you, Major. First of all, I would like to say that even though I'm a government representative from Mali, I'm co-chair of a task team on CSO Development Effectiveness and Enabling Environment. Thank you. I think it was a microphone. Okay, so I was saying that even though I'm a government representative, I'm here in the capacity of co-chair of a task team on CSO Development Effectiveness and Enabling Environment. And this working group was launched in April of 2009 in order to promote commitments made on behalf of CSOs in Accra. As a matter of fact, also, I would like to state that I was present in Istanbul, and it's a good thing that we're celebrating the 7th anniversary of Istanbul, and even participated in the multi-stakeholder portion of the assembly of what was organized by then the Open Forum. So to come back to what's happening on the ground, we believe that in Mali that development effectiveness is about development outcomes. It's about development results. And this is the reason why after participating in a working party for aid effectiveness and participating in elaborating the Paris Declaration, and also elaborating also the indicators that came with Paris. It's important for us not only to commit, but also to implement. And how do you implement? How do you know if you are implementing well? You have to monitor and evaluate. And also on the ground, we believe that you need all stakeholders to participate. You need effective participation from all stakeholders if you want to come about to development results. Thank you.
Yes, and then the next question I'd ask you is, in order for all stakeholders to participate, particularly the civil society, what would be the preconditions for this? Because as you know, in Africa and many other countries, the governments pick and choose who to engage with. And indeed, those who are seen to be very animated about issues or probably not very friendly to the government are not selected. How do we create a structure that ensures it's neutral, but in a way allows for CSOs to organize themselves and government can engage with them as equal partners on policy dialogue issues? Can you share with us some experience?
Thank you, MEJA. Well, I think it has to be clear that government and CSOs have distinct roles, even though those roles are complementary. In my country, what we have tried to do in implementing the development agenda is making sure of inclusiveness and also participation, to make sure the real actors participate in the dialogue. For that instance, ourselves, in our dialogue with donors, what we have decided to do, because aid was not coordinated at a certain time, with the leadership of my boss at the time, we decided not only to coordinate government action, but to make sure also that partners also coordinate their actions. With civil society, what we've decided to do is ask civil society. There's a big open forum in Mali called Conseil National de la Société Civile, Council for National Civil Society, and we asked them to design a member that would be participating in development cooperation actions. So we have created what is called Secrétariat à l'harmonisation de l'aide, Aid Harmonization Secretariat, where we coordinate all government, all stakeholders' actions, and this umbrella organization, which is Conseil National de la Sécurité de la Société Civile, has designated a CSO called FECANGE to participate in that dialogue. So whenever we are meeting government officials, development partners, and CSOs, FECANGE has been designated by the umbrella organization to take part in the dialogue, to make sure that CSOs are present.
Thank you very much. And indeed, organized CSOs become a very important element of engaging with the government, because government is one entity and there are many of us. So I think the idea that you propose of an organized CSO becomes very important. But I want to come to you, RUMMAN. The Istanbul Principles, we are saying, let's self-regulate. And then governments are saying that they need to come up with the legal framework and the regulations for CSOs. Now I'm asking, do you think that CSOs should be regulated or self-regulate, in your view? And as you address that, as you address that issue, I want also you to address how do you think the role of a good enabling environment. How do you feel about a strong legal framework with regard to addressing the issue of enabling environment for CSOs? How important is that in CSO's work? You can use the other microphone. I think that could be helpful. So whether we should be regulated or self-regulate on the one hand, but on the other, the importance of a strong sound legal framework for CSO's enabling environment, in your view. How is that important?
Yeah. Let me begin with what VANI does, and that would in itself clarify lots of questions that you have asked. VANI is an acronym that stands for Voluntary Action Network India. And in Hindi language, VANI means the voice. So we are actually the voice of the voluntary sector in India. VANI is a network of about 500 direct members across the country. And we have a reach of about 15,000 indirect members. So we do cover a wide array of the organizations all across the country. Specifically, what we do is that we bridge the gap between the government and the grassroots NGOs. And we do advocacy with the government on the issues and the concerns of the voluntary sector about the policies of the government. At the same time, we also engage in capacity building of the organizations at the grassroots level to enable compliance widely. As to your specific question, I think self-regulation is certainly more important, but a larger framework needs to be there because that gives us more legitimacy to perform our functions widely. So that actually is what VANI is working for. You know, like if we want to be as organized as the industry, you know, like we need a broad framework in which we need to be recognized as a sector. So yes, I think broad guidelines, broad regulative structure is needed. But within that structure, I think self-regulation from the VOs is equally important. That is what VANI is also working for, towards internal governance of the VOs, towards transparency and accountability, to enable them to follow it voluntarily on their own, to capacitate them towards being transparent and accountable.
Then also, in terms of the legal framework, how important is that, particularly with regard to the demand for registration? And most legal frameworks actually are not about promoting civil society, but to address issues of registration or denial of registration. How do we address that, and how do we make the legal framework be about promoting, developing the sector in a way that is conducive to the work that they do on the one hand, but also guarantees that they are secure within the law and not threatened in a manner that we feel the space is shrinking. So what do you see in terms of the kind of legal framework we have and where we need to go if indeed we are to arrive at a sensible form of broad framework that you talk about? That
in the Indian context, see, the registration laws that we are following, it still dates back to 1880, you know. So yes, we do have problems in the registration law, and we are working with the government to make improvements and changes in that law. You know, so at the moment, the development organizations are all clubbed together with other organizations, which are non-governmental organizations, like a sports club or, you know, a fan club. So even the development organizations are clubbed along with that. So what we are demanding is to make these distinctions, you know, so that the development organizations should be looked at distinctively, you know, and not clubbed as all just non-governmental entities.
Thank you very much. So indeed, colleagues, as you've heard, with regard to legal framework, we need laws, but the laws must be updated if we are to move, and the laws must indeed address the specific needs of specific sector, which is I think is very important, even if it's under principles to be implemented. And furthermore, even self-regulation, yes, the way to go, but the need for a broader framework. But this broader framework, I think, needs to be in the context of how we, it also, CSOs also support or participate in its design. Which then brings me to ZIAD, my friend ZIAD. The issue of fragility comes to mind, and indeed, yesterday you had questions being raised around how we can support countries in fragility in creating their own enabling environment. So I wanted to find out from you, how important is it to you with regard to having a stable and conducive political and social environment for your work? Because we know in the Middle East there's a bit of crisis, not in all countries, but most of them, particularly in MENA region. And our colleagues who work there complain of direct threat to their lives, but also we know the legal framework is increasingly shrinking the space. So and we know the shrinking of space is coming out of the Arab Springs and the other movements that play that role. So we need to have a discussion on how important is the political environment important to your work, and particularly if that political environment is not supportive of your work, what we need to have in place.
Well, first, thank you very much for the introduction. Then it's important to start by making a strong link between the shrinking space and the restrictive measures against civil society and civic participation and the fragility. So fragility leads to more restriction, but more restriction enhanced and triggered instability and fragility. So this is the vicious circle. And let's say that what we are witnessing now in the Middle East is the result of decades of dictatorships, authoritarianism, and restriction on civic participation to hold governments accountable or to participate in the decision making. So I always like to make this strong link between the two issues. And when we are talking about fragility, definitely we are talking about the two dimensions. The first one is the vulnerability, poverty, all these developmental challenges and basic needs that the community needs. But also we are talking about violence and so also in this sense, violence keep people, or let's say, keep people living in need. So increase the basic needs, poverty, unemployment, or all this kind. So always there is an interlink between the fragility situation at large and the living conditions as well as the restrictive measures. The main challenges when you are talking about the fragile, you are talking about first weak policies, you are talking about weak institutions, and you are talking about weak governance, which means that restrictive participation is not only related to the legal framework or to the restriction measures. It's also related to the inability to influence the decision-making process or to enhance civic participation in the decision-making or at the political level when you have weak institutions. So you don't have a very clear decision-making processes where civil society can engage in order to influence or to give a say. So this is one. Or when you have weak governance, then all kind of transparency, accountability, responsibility also are not functioning very well. So this is an additional dimension adding to, let's say, the restriction of. Back to the region. I mean, the situation varies. It's not. We are talking about 22 countries, which means that we have 22 different realities. So you have countries in conflict where the state totally collapsed, or the state is not able anymore to provide all or different kinds of services to the population. In a reality where civil society was restricted, weak, and did not exist before, so now you are exposed to a reality where you don't have a state providing services and civil society is unable or doesn't have enough capacity in order to respond to the basic needs. So this is one reality, but you have another reality being more positive, countries in transition, where it's a matter of struggle and a balance of power between the state and the society. And in some realities, like in Tunis, for example, civil society is able sometimes to challenge the decision making and to open more space for civil society. Allow me here to say that the enabling environment is definitely about the legal framework, but it's also about two main dimensions. The first, the political will, the political willingness of the decision makers, of the state, of the government, to enhance civic participation, to make more consultation with civil society, or this political will does not exist. And this is a matter of a struggle. And the second one is about capacity. And definitely this is, up to the civil society and how we can, let's say, empower civil society in order to become a strong partner in the decision making, addressing the different kind of development, but also in questioning and holding the government accountable. So these are the two dimensions that we need to address in this circle.
Yeah, very, very good phone. Thank you very much, ZIAD. And quickly, because I also want to give the plenary a chance to respond, I'll come now to Tony. And Tony, you basically spent your life building capacity of South and West CSOs. And one of the challenges we have to do with the issue of the finances and financial sustainability of those groups. Now, one of the things that we are accused of coming from the South is that we are donor dependent, and therefore we don't really speak to our issues. We speak to issues that donor want, and that we are appendages of donors. So from your experience, do you think that donor funding compromises CSO ownership of development initiatives? Then how can we secure resources that guarantee that citizens, CSOs are indeed independent, as we say they are, to fulfill their mandate? To you, Tony.
Well, just to frame this conversation, when we talk about enabling environment, basically it's about recognition or registration. Then the other one is on dialogue space. And the third one would be support for CSOs. And indeed, supporting CSOs is a fundamental aspect of enabling environment. The problem is that often we look at supporting CSOs as financial support from donors. And that's not very true. The truth is, the support from CSOs comes from CSOs themselves. And therefore, the CSOs themselves become enablers, or they also are important actors in ensuring enabling environment. For example, at Ibon, we do a lot of capacity building at the grassroots. And so we don't provide money. And actually, a lot of the work that we do is pro bono, and at the same time, we resource that money, not necessarily from donors. On the other hand, if you look at the world around us, we assume that the support comes basically from donors and INGOs. And that is also not very true, because a lot of the support comes from institutions and governments at local level or at national level. So just to frame this conversation. Number two, the question of does it compromise your support? Indeed, CSOs need to be self-reliant, and especially at the grassroots, you'll find that grassroots CSOs are really self-reliant and not dependent on support. And it's important to assert their independence. But on the other hand, we also need to recognize that CSOs provide public service and are fundamental in a functioning democracy. And therefore, indeed, that's why CSOs have to be supported by national governments and also by donors. So that's fundamental, and this is something that we should not be ashamed of. But at the Working Party, we have big debates, especially remember our chair then was somebody from Egypt. And Egypt's thought, and some other countries assumed, that Southern national CSOs are subverting sovereignty because they receive donor funding. And we insist that in the first place, the assumption is that CSOs are independent in their own right. And when you receive money from wherever it comes from, then you have to be, it is not axiomatic that if you receive that money, therefore you are at the dictates of. Of course, there's also the question of how autonomous you are and how do you really live to your principles of effectiveness. But on the other hand, I think the question is independence and self-reliance should not be interpreted absolutely, meaning that some CSOs say we'll never receive money because we are independent. No way. That's absurd. You should receive that money because that money comes from the people's taxes, whether from the north or the south, and use that to the best uses for human rights and poverty reduction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very good. Now I want to open the floor, the plenary, for you also to share your thoughts. Be very short if it is a comment, and if you have to ask a question, maybe 2 questions at most, please. So please, feel free who would like to express themselves on the issues that we've discussed. Yes, I'll start with Wulia and then Bangladesh. Do you have a microphone here?
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much to all the panelists for their remarks. So 2 only, yeah? Okay. So I'll start with our colleague from VANI. I'm Julio Sanchez, so I'm head of a similar organization to VANI in Canada. And we're working with other charities, we're called charities in Canada, to reform our legislation, because it's almost as old as yours and comes from the same inspiration from British colonial times. But we're not making the difference between hospitals and sports clubs and international development NGOs, for example. So I'm really curious to understand why in India you think it's so important to make that difference between development organizations and others. If you could just elaborate on that. And maybe a question for Tony. I think what you've expressed, I think we all agree with that in principle, but I think the point of the Istanbul Principles is that there is that slippery slope and pressures from donors and governments to control our agendas. And maybe you could elaborate on how the Istanbul Principles are a tool to help us stay true to our missions and stay independent and not be controlled by the different sources of funding that we receive. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Bangladesh.
So, in fact, I have a comment, and as a non-CSO, I am standing here. I am not sure if I merit commenting on your enabling environment, but anyway, based on my observation, I am just suggesting this particular comment. I echo I buy the point made by you about that the enabling legal regime is fundamental to enabling environment for CSO effectiveness. In many countries, what I see from my observation that sometimes government gives certification or permission for some NGOs and sometimes don't. And this in fact creates some kind of discrimination. And so it directly relates to CSO effectiveness, but what I see that is a major concern for me as a citizen, and also should be for you as civil society organizations, that you maintain sometimes very inconsistency in your approach. When so you perceive the other civil society organizations, particularly what I see the faith-based organizations, when they are silenced, the mainstream civil society organizations who consider themselves as liberal and secular, they remain normally silent. So today you are remaining silent when some other NGO organizations are being silenced, then eventually lead to your silence also. So I think that you need to maintain a consistent approach, despite you have differences in opinion, in strategies, in programs. So you need to in fact remain committed to protecting other voices in order to protect your voices in the long run, because always there is a chance of regime change. So eventually we understand the impacts of regime change. So my suggestion would be for all civil society organizations that we need to maintain a consistent approach in our business and in our thoughts. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Georgine.
Sí, felicitar a los panelistas por su experiencia acumulada y el trabajo desarrollado.
I want to congratulate the panel for the experience and what they achieved.
Okay. Pregunto, ¿qué valoración tiene el panel sobre en qué momento o qué momento está viviendo la sociedad civil a nivel global. Hemos retrocedido.
My question goes towards like to the panel. Where do you think civil society is right now on the global level?
Hemos retrocedido, hay diferentes tipos de sociedad civil. ¿Cuál es ese nivel de relación entre gobierno y sociedad civil? ¿Hay alguna valoración?
Okay. Are we going backwards? Are there some elements that are positive and others that different types of from different types of civil society, and how can this work? And what is the last point?
Sobre si valoran si hay diferentes tipos de sociedad civil.
Sí.
Si la relación con gobiernos y sociedad civil ha progresado o cómo se mantiene.
Sí, okay. So the question goes to how the relationship between government and civil society, is it really improving, or is it improving only for a certain kind of civil society and not for the diversity of civil society? This is the question. Thank you.
Very good. So let's try to address these issues first, then we can do a second round, because I don't want us to be a monologue where you answer, we answer. So, well, I opened it, told me there was a specific question to you, but then any member of panelists can take on any issue, especially VANI, on this issue of how you are reforming the legal framework.
Thank you. I think the question really is, first of all, as a CSO, to know who you are, what you think your mandate is. And indeed, it goes into the heart of the question of accountability. Before you can receive any money or to seek money, you first understand that you are accountable to your constituency, your staff, your board, and so on, before you talk about accountability to the donors, because they are the least of your concern. And that is where I think a lot of the slippery slope is when people forget about their fundamental accountability to their members and their constituency. And for us at Ibon, for example, we reject some funding because it does not go to our mandate. Why should we seek some money when it's not what we want to do? And many CSOs, because of the need or the attraction of funding, will accept that money even though it's not really who they are. The second question is the principle of partnership. And indeed, the issue of partnership remains very fundamental for CSOs, because support is a function of partnership amongst ourselves and other institutions that we partner with. And indeed, many of us fail in the Istanbul principles in recognizing the question of equality, mutual cooperation, and other principles of partnership. And that's where a stronger partner or the funding partner now dictates or shapes or creates the framework by which a recipient partner is in effect captured, if you will. Indeed, there are many elements that we need to look in the question of support. Then when you go now to the issue of support of donors and governments, then my God, there is where it becomes even problematic, because then governments, whether donors or national governments, by nature dictate on their programs, and you have to follow that. And this is where we think that the question of developing participatory governance is fundamental. For now, the assumption is that the donor agencies, the parliaments, the aid agencies, the national governments have their program, and you just have to follow that. And many of the CSOs just accept that. They just think that probably we can shape it a bit, but essentially they have to follow the dictates or the policies of the agencies. In this day and age, it's changing a bit, because now we are able to question the policies, and in the end, it affects also how it is being shaped. But if you ask me, the reform has only achieved 1%.
Good points. VANI?
Thank you, Ulia, for your question. Why we think it's important to distinguish between hospitals or other such, a sports club or any other entity other than a development organization?
Maybe we need the microphone.
Yeah. Is it better now?
Yeah, it's better.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. It has taken us a research of many years and consultations, many consultations with the leaders of civil society to arrive at this conclusion that we need this kind of distinction in the registration laws. Because we often read reports in the media that NGOs are not filing their returns, NGOs are not auditing their accounts. And that translates media in a large way is responsible for building the opinion of the people and the image of the sector, certainly. Then we went back to the sector and we asked with our partners and other leaders, and we found that this is not what the NGO, what the development organizations are doing. You know, like we are filing our returns, we are doing all the other things. We are not most of us are not misappropriating the funds. Of course, there are black sheep, certainly, and we believe that they need to be weeded out. But most of the development organizations are doing the required basic, what is required by the government. So I think, like we have hospitals who are registered as charities, charitable organizations. We have huge sports clubs, whose turnover runs into crores and crores. And there are these small little development organizations whose turnover is like, maybe just a few lakhs. So, but the government comes up with the directives which club all these organizations together. So that is why it becomes imperative. And to be fair, you cannot even blame the government entirely for it, because we don't have a nodal agency, a focal point in the government for the voluntary sector. That is why I said why an overarching regulatory network is important, so that we have some place where we can go to address these problems. If there is no focal agency, who do we go to? So I think these are very important questions to deal with.
Now the panel is getting very interesting. Yes, ZIAD.
I have two quick comments. One on the law. Whether the law is old or new, I don't think that this is a matter, because, for example, in Lebanon we apply a law which comes back to the 1901, which is the French law, and believe me that this is one of the best laws that we have in the region. The issue is that we had, since 1901, a very liberal law for civil society, but few weeks ago only, we adopted a law, the right to access information, which means that you have a very liberal law for civil society, but you have restriction to access information. And sometimes, let's say, the Egyptian constitution is very liberal. In the constitution, all the rights should be provided for all the people. But the law is highly restrictive, and it's not only restriction about the creation and the work of civil society, but the most important is to access resources. In some other cases, like in Tunis, the law is good, but the administration was not able to develop in order to implement the law. So restrictions are coming from the administration. So I think we have different aspects when we are talking about the legal framework and the enabling environment. So it's not only about the law, it's also about the administration, it's also about the political will. We have. The second issue that I wanted to say is about the space for civil society, it's very important to take into consideration when we are talking about the international dimension. There is something called the policy space and the shrinking policy space. I think that there is a direct relation between the shrinking policy space, which is due to the international or global systemic issues. I mean, we have a lot of, let's say, Egypt negotiated 5 years with the IMF to get a loan of $12 billion. A country in transition with a deep economic and social crisis, badly in need of money, so they negotiated 5 years. But the result, they concluded, I mean, the deal with the IMF with some conditionality and very hard and severe conditionality, like raising the taxes, some austerity measures, lifting subsidies, etc. There is a shrinking space for civil, and the link between the shrinking space for policy making, policy space, and the shrinking space for civil society. So this makes more pressure on the, or tension between the decision makers, the policy makers, the state, and the civil society, which leads to more restriction on civil society. Another issue, talking about the fragility and the war on terror, or this kind of addressing conflicts. The new definition of ODA reflects something deep inside, I mean, in a political approach, a new paradigm, how we understand the global partnership and how we understand the role of the global community in addressing these issues. I mean, when you have more money for ODA, but you have less money for development to address, let's say, inequalities, poverty, social and economic needs, while you have more money for security, defense, and you have more money for humanitarian intervention, etc., which means that this is, we are witnessing a very serious and very challenging paradigm shift in the understanding of the international financial aid, or in the international, let's say, global partnership for development. Not to mention what happened in the Financing for Development Summit, where now they are relying more on the domestic resource mobilization, where private sector privatization, etc. are.
No, in fact, yeah. Before I speak to that, also let's hear MODIBO.
Yes, I'm going to try to respond to the lady's question. As a matter of fact, from Paris Declaration, I would like to state also that the task team that I represent include donors represented by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from the Netherlands, and civil society represented by CPDE. From Paris to Nairobi, it's been a long way. As I said earlier, I participated in Paris in preparing the Paris Declaration. And the first meeting we had was in the Ministry of Finance. And the question the organizers asked us is, what do we do with civil society? They didn't know where civil society would fit in the agenda. And we had suggested to them that, you know, maybe civil society could meet, and then the resolutions and recommendations could be fed into the plenary afterwards. And this is what was finally done. But after Accra, Busan, where Tony fought like a lion, was my fellow Sherpa, negotiating the Busan document, even though we also assisted him a bit, partner countries, because we didn't want him to be by himself against some countries that didn't want to hear about CSOs, and having a CSOs included in the document, especially. No, it was, you know, we all assisted each other, so it was very friendly, friendly dialogue. And it came out to an eventful document. So it's been a long way. So now we have GPI2, Global Indicator 2, monitoring the CSO activities and effectiveness. I think this is progress, even though it's slow, but I think it's a long way from where we were in Paris. Secondly, what I would like to say that we are in an evolving world in this age of patriotism, populism, racism, nationalism in large democracies. It's becoming more difficult to make sure that democracy, that there are democratic models. There are very few democratic models now. As I was listening to Reuters yesterday, and the UN branch on human rights tackled two large democracies that I'm not going to cite. But had they not cited the names, I would have thought they were countries from the developing part of the world. I think also, to my friend on my right here, there's a prerequisite to governance and effective institutions. I'm a policymaker. I've been a policymaker for 15 years. It's not a very long time, but it's enough to have seen enough changes around me. And we are subjected to external shocks. And what are external shocks? There's a prerequisite to governance, and it's peace and security. And when I mean security, it's with a capital S. I'm talking about physical security. In the Sahelian part of Africa, I've seen a report this morning that 20 million people are threatened from Senegal to Somalia to Yemen, just because of a drought. And you also have the phenomenon of jihadism, terrorism, and you also have food insecurity associated with climate change.